after lunch. Now we have the topic critical care nephrology, mainly AKI, and it will be done by Dr. Prakash Shastri, Sir Gangaram Hospital, New Delhi. And may I invite Chairperson Dr. Om, HOD Nephrology, IGIMS, Dr. Harsh, Assistant Professor Nephrology, IGIMS, and Dr. Sashi, Consultant Nephrology, Paras HMRI.
I must thank the organizer and the management to give us opportunity to be in this session, very important session, which will be delivered by Dr. Prakash Shastri, not less than Dr. Prakash Shastri, who is Vice Chairman, Critical Care Sir Gangaram Hospital. We all know that this critical care nephrology is a very new thing, almost 2-3 decades old, and it is a multidisciplinary thing which deals with the crossroad issues at the crossroad of intensive physician and nephrology. Without wasting much time, I invite Dr. Prakash Shastri to deliver his lecture on critical care nephrology.
Thank you very much, and I must thank the organizers, Dr. Deepak and Kishore, to have invited me to deliver this lecture in front of such an audience, a very knowledgeable audience, I would say. But let me remind you, people like me, and there are a lot of other people, senior people, we have our own idiosyncrasies about giving lectures. We tend to give what we want to speak. And there are certain aspects of the lecture which I'm very fond of, so you'll have to bear it. And there are certain aspects of the lecture which would be meant for your interest. Obviously, you will take part in it. And finally, hopefully in the end, there will be some conclusions which we will take back home. And I hope it generates some controversy so that you people can ask me questions. And I'll be helped by the eminent panel of chairpersons with me here, because I may not have all the answers to those questions, so that probably they will help me out. So basically, the topic that was given to me was critical care nephrology. And being an intensivist and not a nephrologist, I confined myself to acute kidney injury. Personally, I believe that acute kidney injury is a different ballgame altogether, and you cannot extrapolate the knowledge of managing patients of chronic kidney disease into the management of AKI, because implicit in the management of AKI is the prevention of AKI, and these things can only be done by people who man the ICU, who stay in the ICU all the time, and they are the intensivists. So we'll be talking about acute kidney injury, the management, diagnosis, causes and pathophysiology. I will obviously confine myself to certain aspects of it and not deal with the entire subject. So to begin with, I have to remind all of you that acute kidney injury still remains a syndrome with significant morbidity and mortality. Despite all the advancements that have happened in the field of medical care in general, the mortality of a patients who developed an acute kidney injury and renal failure in the intensive care unit, the mortality goes up to as high as 50%. So that is the kind of problem that we are dealing with. And this situation is very, very common. And the commonness of this syndrome has been highlighted by this prospective Finnish study, acronymed FINAKI, in which they took the records of around 3,000 patients, and they found that the incidence of acute kidney injury confined to the ICU was as high as 40%. And what are the risk factors which made these patients go into AKI? They were hypovolemia, diuretics, artificial colloids, and the presence of pre-existing chronic kidney disease, and these were identified as major and independent risk factors for developing AKI in the ICU. And all of you people who are in the room would recognize that most of these risk factors are there in their patients, and so willy-nilly, either by knowledge or otherwise, we are putting our patients to increased risk of developing acute kidney injury in the ICU. And despite that, some patients actually do go out of the ICU. It is because of their luck and not because of our intentions. So to talk about the incidence, there's a lot of literature on the incidence of acute kidney injury, because various parts of the world are not talking in the same language. To give an instance, in 1994 there was one systematic review of 28 studies on renal failure after surgery. Now this is one subset of patients who develop an acute kidney injury after a surgical insult, and they found that in that 28 studies, no one study use the same criteria to different renal failure. So 28 studies use different definition as to how to diagnose an acute kidney injury. So there was diversity of opinion there, and there was an urgent need to develop a language in which we would be at terms and we would be talking in the same language. And as many as 199 different definitions for acute renal failure were used in clinical practice, and no wonder when they reported the incidence was not one number, it was a range, and that range went from 1% to 25%, with mortality rates ranging from 40% to 90%. So that was the kind of information or data that we had, and you heard Dr. Barunia telling you that we need to know the information first before we can do something about it, and this was the kind of myriad information that we had, and with this information really you can't do much about it. And that is why some wise men people came together and they decided that they would have a uniform definition of acute kidney injury, and they devised what is called the RIFLE criteria. The RIFLE is actually an acronym in which consists of risk, injury and failure, which are the first three classes of RIFLE criteria, and there are two outcome classes, which is loss and end-stage kidney disease. And this was the first attempt to actually quantify or the patients who can be enrolled into a study, so that some epidemiological studies can be done in the beginning, and later on we can increase our knowledge about the pathophysiology and improve upon the way we manage these patients. The prefix of this this exercise was that this acute kidney injury should be abrupt, and by abrupt they meant less than 7 days. So that was the cutoff point, and this was the first attempt in making a uniform definition of an acute kidney injury in the intensive care unit. And these were the criteria for classifying patients to know the severity of acute kidney injury. We had the GFR criteria on one hand, and we had the urine output criteria. Either one of the two could make the patient lie in either the risk, injury, failure, loss or end-stage disease, and this is how we staged. And this staging of the acute kidney injury would later on lead to our prognostication as to how this patient is going to fare in the long-term stay in the intensive care unit. So this was the RIFLE criteria, which was developed in the late 90s, and then subsequently it was found that there was significant amount of problem related to it, because at that point of time nobody bothered about inclusion of any criteria for renal replacement therapy, and the entire concept of renal replacement therapy was not incorporated in the definition. So obviously some patients who were in RIFLE category, lower categories, would come up to the first category just because they undergo dialysis. There was some confusion in that regard, and that the other was the criteria for progression of AKI or timing. Like for example, most of the times we get patients from the casualty or the emergency coming in a state of shock. We resuscitate them with 2 liters and 3 liters of fluids, and by 24 hours we managed to get a urine output, we managed to get the creatinine down. So obviously we have managed that patient pretty well. But this patient actually came in a loss category when he came to us on day 1, but by day 2 he was behaving like any other normal patient. So these were certain discrepancies which were noticed, and then they were addressed in what is called as acute kidney injury network, and which was a report of an initiative to improve outcome in acute kidney injury, and this was authored by none other than Dr. Ravindra L. Mehta. And I was fortunate that Dr. Ravindra Mehta had actually come down to Delhi in 2012. He's a product of PGI Chandigarh, by the way, and he is now settled in the United States and is an absolute authority over acute kidney injury, runs classes, runs workshops on CRRT and other things. People who are interested might approach him, and he had actually come and delivered lectures on various modalities in managing these patients of acute kidney injury, and he was authoring this acute kidney injury network, in which again they found a diagnostic criteria of AKI, which was again an abrupt reduction in the kidney functions. He became a bit more objective in what he meant by the reduction in the kidney function, and he used serum creatinine and as a benchmark, and he said that if the serum creatinine increased by at least 0.3 milligram per deciliter, or there was a 50% or 150, if the creatinine was 1 to begin with, it became 1.5. That means there was a 50% increase in creatinine. Then you can label this patient as having AKI. Or in case you don't have creatinine levels with you, then you can go by the decrease in the urine output. If there is a documented oliguria of less than 0.5 milliliter per kg per hour for 6 hours at a stretch, not for 1 hour or 2 hours. For a 6 hours as a stretch, if the patient is producing less than, let us say, 30 ml per hour, then you can label this patient as acute kidney injury. And again, the Aiken network had again serum creatinine criteria. You remember in the rifle criteria we mentioned about the GFR criteria. In this case, they have removed the GFR criteria. They have included only the serum creatinine criteria and of course the urine output criteria, which were used in tandem in the classification and staging. The important thing about classification of staging was about the prognostication and how the patient would fare in the days and weeks to come. And again, the serum creatinine criteria were 0.3 milligram per deciliter increase, which went up to, that is 150% of baseline to begin with, then 200% of baseline to begin with, to go on, and subsequently finally 300% of the baseline in the end. And the corresponding urine output criteria was 0.5 ml per kilo for 6 hours, then less than 0.5 ml per kilo for 12 hours, and less than 0.3 ml per kilo for 24 hours, or anuria for 12 hours. So this was the the lexicon that they started in using, and Aiken went a long way in making the diagnosis or labeling the patients at AKI the world over, and including us, we also adopted this criteria, and at least we generated a homogeneous set of patients where we could say that, okay, these are the homogeneous patients we included in our cohort, these are the things that we did with these patients, and this is how they fared. And these are the patients possibly who do well with early dialysis. These are the patients where possibly you could delay dialysis and maybe still have a better outcome. So the rifle criteria was just one advancement over the Aiken criteria was just an advancement over the rifle criteria, and there were a lot of overlapping factors between the two. It is probably academic discussion, so probably I'll skip it. But the important thing that has happened over the last few years is that all that thing has been now amalgamated into one, which is called the KDIGO Clinical Practice Guidelines for Acute Kidney Injury, and this was published as late as 2012, and that has really removed a lot of cobwebs in our approach to this patient, how to label this patient as having acute kidney injury to begin with, what is the timing, what is at what stage we should go for dialysis in this patient, and what are the stages and which we can stop dialysis in these patients, and what are the patients where we label this patient as dialysis dependent and maybe advise for a kidney biopsy, and maybe take this case further on, maybe hand it over to the nephrologist so that they can manage it on a long-term basis, have a fistula in place, for example, for long-term dialysis, and so on and so forth. So it has got management repercussions. So we'll talk a little bit about this KDIGO guidelines. Here the guidelines suggest that the AKI is defined as increase in serum creatinine by 0.3 milligram. You know, we talked about 50% increase and 100% increase and 200% increase in the past. Now we are just saying that if within 48 hours, if the creatinine goes up by as low as 0.3 milligram per deciliter, or if it is 1.5 times the baseline, there are so many 80-year-old ladies with hardly any muscle mass present, they come to us with a creatinine of 0.5. And now if you go and do their creatinine clearance in this patient, you will find that the creatinine clearance is only 30 ml per hour. So creatinine per se is of very limited value unless we take into consideration the patient's general status, the state of nutrition, the state of muscle mass, and so on and so forth. So that is why it's the concept of making a baseline is very important. So any increase in serum creatinine over and above 1.5 times the baseline, which is known or presumed to have occurred within the prior 7 days, would label this patient as having AKI. Or anything, urine output of less than 0.5 ml per kilo for 6 hours would again label this patient as having AKI. And again, the staging of AKI has become much more simpler. It is divided into 1, 2 and 3, and you can see that serum creatinine stage 1 is just 0.3 milligram increase, and I'm sorry, this is less than 3 times, but it's probably it's more than 2 times on the first side and more than 3 times in stage 3, and corresponding urine output criteria that we have talked about earlier, 0.5 for 6 hours, 0.5 for 12 hours, and 0.3 ml per kilo for 24 hours, or anuria more than 12 hours. So this is similar to ACIN. So this KDIGO guidelines follows the ACIN criteria as far as the urine output at least is concerned. So much so about my personal interest in speaking my personal contribution in this lecture. So now what I will do is I'll invite all of you people to take part in this lecture and tell me certain answers to certain questions possibly I don't know many about. Okay, so my first question is, which of the following fluids when used for resuscitation in equivalent volumes is least likely to prevent AKI in a patient with shock? 0.9% saline, Ringer's lactate, 5% albumin, 10% HES, and 3% saline is least likely to prevent AKI. Yes, any takers? Least likely. So most likely to produce renal failure. Albumin, Ringer lactate. No takers? 5% albumin. Any takers? It will prevent. Well, it will not prevent, or it will prevent. So the question is, least likely to prevent AKI. 10% HES. Yes. 3% HES. Yes. Somebody is very vehement. So colloids in the form of hydroxyethyl starch. So just a little bit about discussion about the quality of, the type of fluids that we use in resuscitation, and there we can see, I'm sorry. Okay, right, and there you can see that this study actually used 4 group of solutions: crystalloids only, hypooncotic colloids, artificially produced colloids, and albumin. And you can see that this was the percentage increase in creatinine. The highest percentage increase in creatinine is this diamond, and this diamond corresponds to hyperoncotic albumin. So hyperoncotic albumin will be anything above 5% albumin. We generally have 20% albumin available to us. So 20% albumin, at least in this, actually showed that there is a fairly high incidence of increase in creatinine, so the fairly high incidence of AKI. So 5% albumin is gone, and if you look about crystalloids only, which are the square figures, you can see the crystalloids are down below. So the crystalloids are least likely to produce, but if you ask about which is the maximum, which is the fluid which is likely to produce renal failure in the maximum instance of cases, it would be the artificially oncotic colloids. And there are wonderful studies which were produced in 2000, which were published in 2012 and 2000 Christmas study, 5S, 6S study, and so on, which actually did show that when colloids in the form of hydroxyethyl starch is used as a fluid of resuscitation in patients of septic or septic shock, then the chances of these patients needing renal replacement therapy is very high, and these are the patients who might not have higher mortality but would stay in for a longer period of time. That was the conclusion of those studies. So hydroxyethyl starch is one fluid possibly you will not use for resuscitation in your patients in the critical care unit, and that is the message that this study is giving. And so here you can see that there is a systematic review of all these studies that I talked about, and you can see that the studies, the meta-analysis favors crystalloid over colloids, and here the colloid was HES. The crystalloids are favored over colloids in resuscitation to prevent renal failure in the intensive care unit. Okay, next question. Are you with me now? 62-year-old hypertensive male admitted to the ICU 2 hours ago, likely urosepsis, has put out only 30 ml of urine. He has received 3 liters of isotonic crystalloids in the ER. So in the emergency room, he has been resuscitated quite well. He has got 3 liters of crystalloids. He is awake. That means his brain is being perfused. Has a mean arterial pressure of 65 millimeters of mercury. That means the goal-directed therapy is being followed. Now the question is, this patient was having oliguria to begin with. He has been resuscitated with IV fluid and crystalloids. What would you consider to prevent AKI? Start Renaldone dopamine infusion at 2 micron per kilo. Any takers? No? Start norepinephrine infusion to raise mean arterial pressure to 75 millimeters of mercury. People shaking their heads, but anybody saying yes? Yes. You are saying yes? Okay. Avoid norepinephrine as it may cause severe renal vasoconstriction. Anybody bold enough to say yes to that? Because when I started my practice in critical care, at least half the physicians that I would encounter would tell me that. And this was of course 10 years ago at least. But okay, now this audience is much better informed, so I'm not taking. Give Lasix as a bolus 40 milligram. Anybody say yes to that? Yes, you would like to give? You have given 3 liters of Tesla to the patient. He is not producing urine. Would you give a bolus of Lasix to this patient?
Yes.
Loop your diuretics in AKI. That's a controversial surgery, but I've got a very eminent panel of chairpersons here, and I'm sure they'll agree with me that giving loop diuretics is like flogging a dying horse. When you give diuretics to the patient, you're actually increasing the oxygen consumption of the nephrons, and that is not good news for the tubular cells as well as the Bowman capsules and other things. But the argument in favor is that when diuretics are given, at least there is urine output. There is no doubt about it. Urine output comes out, and the proponents of giving diuretics is that they say that by giving diuretics, what I'm doing is I'm converting a non-oliguric renal failure. I'm converting an oliguric renal failure into a non-oliguric renal failure, and that's why I don't have to call the nephrologist. I don't have to tell him to dialyze my patients. I'll manage the patients on my own. The patient will pay less and be more happy, and the patient has to pay less to the hospital also. So that was the argument generally given, that it converts oliguric renal failure into a non-oliguric renal failure. Patient escapes undergoing dialysis and obviously the side effects related to dialysis, and we have to only manage a non-oliguric renal failure, which is very easier to manage. But that is something which has the thinking has changed on that, and it has been found that diuretics actually do more harm than good, and that's why in these days probably between the two, if the choice is between giving high dose diuretic to the patient and dialyzing the patient is concerned, especially in a center like mine which has dialysis in the ICU, and I manage the dialysis units, then I don't have to really think twice and use a dialysis machine. So things have moved, and this was a study which says, again Ravindra Mehta has produced this study, and he mentioned that taking into so many confounding factors which are always present in intensive care patients, diuretic usage significantly increased the risk of death or non-recovery of renal function, and that is why the use of diuretics in critically ill patients with acute renal failure should be discouraged. So that is so much so about the diuretics. But yes, there are a lot of takers for mean arterial pressures getting up, and this is a study which tries to talk about the autoregulation of blood flow. Though I don't have time to go into the details of it, except that if the mean arterial pressure is increased beyond a point, the renal perfusion pressure is possibly improved, and that possibly increases the urine output, and that is why it is a very prudent line of thinking to actually try and jack up the mean arterial pressure in order to get a higher perfusing pressure to the kidney, and that would perhaps help you in getting the urine output of this patient rather than giving diuretic to the patient. And the other thing about there would be other study, I hope, which says that actually the blood flow to the kidney actually increases and there is no vasoconstriction, because the driving force which sends blood to the kidney is the mean arterial pressure and not the vasoconstricting effect of noradrenaline, and that is why it has been generally agreed upon, and all the intensivists are very clear in their approach that they give noradrenaline to the patients to increase the mean arterial pressure, and that possibly improves the renal perfusion pressure. And something that they have come to realize, that IV norepinephrine does not induce renal ischemia. Again, this is a study which has shown that when norepinephrine is given as an infusion, the mean arterial pressure goes up, the renal blood flow goes up, the renal vascular resistance actually comes down, and that is why that has a beneficial beneficial effect upon the glomerular filtration rate, and that's why the urine output picks up. So that was a misconceptions that we had in the past, and that's where we are moved on. So one more question. 72-year-old diabetic, severe abdominal pain, bloody diarrhea, initial lab serum creatinine 1.6, 2 plus proteinuria. Diagnosis of ischemic bowel disease is suspected. Surgeon requests a CT abdomen with IV and oral contrast. Which of the following measures is least likely to minimize his risk of contrast nephropathy? I'm sure all of you working in intensive care are dealing with this kind of situation. Patient is having a suspected abdominal problem. The surgeon says, I will not get any information about the abdomen unless I give a contrast to this patient. And I, as an intensivist, I'm saying that I'm battling with his urine output. The moment you give him contrast, this patient will go into frank acute renal failure. So what should I do? So the question is, use a non-ionic isoosmolar contrast. Because diagnosis is important. You have to undergo diagnosis. You have to make a diagnosis. And if the diagnosis means giving contrast to the patient, well, so be it, because that is going to lead to the change in the management of the patient. So the only thing that I have to do is modify whatever I am doing so that I reduce the risk of acute kidney injury. And that is something which can be done by use of non-ionic isoosmolar contrast. Everybody would agree to that? Yeah, and so isotonics, bicarbonate bolus followed by an infusion. Now I would like anybody coming forward with this. Would anybody like to give bicarbonate to the patient just because bicarbonate has been shown to reduce the risk of acute kidney injury in patients who have contrast-induced nephropathy? Anybody, any takers for this?
Out of 4 options.
No, I'm talking about just the bicarbonate solution right now. There is a wonderful study which actually shows that bicarbonate infusion prior to radiocontrast exposure reduces the incidence of AKI. But in a critical care setting, with the kind of fixed ideas that critical care physicians have regarding bicarbonate, would you like to use it as a matter of routine, as a matter of protocol? The nurses can do it on their own. No? Sir, anybody, your opinion?
I think it is advised in prevention of contrast.
I have told you that. There is one study, wonderful study, which actually shows that it has done so.
Important is hydration. Whether it is
Well, okay, we'll come to that. Okay, IV theophylline, especially if adequate hypertension is not possible. Any takers for IV theophylline? Yes or no? No? IV infusion of selective dopamine 1 and agonist phenoldiazepam. No. Okay. Right. So when we talk about radiocontrast induced nephropathy, the usual risk factors are age. The older the patient, the more are the chances that he would like to get radiocontrast induced nephropathy. So obviously in older patient you will be more careful and probably be using something to prevent it. And I would agree with our chairperson that probably I will concern myself with hydration. But we'll talk about the volume of contrast. If the amount of contrast that the patient is exposed is less, obviously the risk is less. And if there is a pre-existing renal function, that is another risk factor. But ionic versus non-ionic and osmolarity of the contrast, these are the other risk factors which can lead to AKI. And the thing that we have most control upon is concomitant hypovolemia and the usage or otherwise of nephrotoxin. We tend to use a lot of nephrotoxic drugs in the intensive care units. We tend to be very poor in our assessment of volume status in our patients, and these are perhaps the two things that are the biggest risk factors for producing radiocontrast induced nephropathy, and these are the areas where we can make a difference. And it has been shown that low osmolarity contrast media and isoosmolar contrast media tend to have lesser risk. And in the prophylaxis of contrast-induced nephropathy, there is this study in which theophylline and acetylcysteine and both were joined together, and there was not much of a difference. I'm sorry, you saying something? Oh, okay. The acetylcysteine again, the jury is still out as to whether it actually helps or not, but what really helps is that N-acetylcysteine is not given as a bolus. N-acetylcysteine is diluted in, let us say, normal saline and given over 6 hours or something. So maybe it is not the N-acetylcysteine which acts as an antioxidant and prevents the oxidant-induced injury to the nephrons. It is perhaps the volume that the N-acetylcysteine is given that really makes a difference. So again, N-acetylcysteine cannot be really ascribed as to be preventer of contrast-induced nephropathy, but ultimately the point where everybody would agree is that if the patient is hydrated well, and even if you have to prophylactically give a liter of normal saline to the patient and give 1 liter of fluid as the patient is going down to the CT scan, maybe that would be the thing to do. And if at all you are so concerned about it that this patient is having decreased creatinine output, again in a center like mine, I don't have to worry about overloading my patients too much, because number one, they are intubated and ventilated, so the chance of pulmonary edema is less, and number two, in my center again the dialysis machine is available to me, and if necessary I can always offload this patient and do some ultrafiltration in this case. One more area where a lot of work needs to be done is the biomarkers. Unfortunately, there is no magic bullet available to us for better risk estimation for the development and validations of preventive measures against AKI. And that is why more sensitive biomarkers are urgently needed. The only biomarker commercially available today is serum neutrophil gelatinase associated lipocalin, which is euphemistically called NGAL. But then it has got certain limitations in conditions like sepsis and other things. The creatinine levels cannot be relied upon completely, and another setting where NGAL apparently failed to perform is early predictor of something which we talked about just now, as contrast-induced nephropathy. There are certain limitations, but at the moment the only biomarker available to us is NGAL. In my research period when I was a research registrar, I had used cystatin as one of the markers of indicating it. Unfortunately, none of them have really borne the test of time, and they have gone out of the window. NGAL again has not found clinical application uniformly across the hospitals, and that's the reason is that it is still not the ideal thing. So the recommendations that this KDIGO guidelines give is that it is important that we have a protocol-based management of hemodynamic and oxidation parameters. Dr. Samadar very explicitly showed what are the points to be looked into to actually make sure that the organ perfusion is taking place to prevent AKI, just the way you try to prevent other organ dysfunction. AKI is just one of them. One important factor we tend to miss out, that India is a capital of diabetes, and that is why it is important, especially in critical care illness where they tend to be intolerant to blood sugar. You need to control the blood sugar. Again, controlling of blood sugar means you don't have to really do a very tight control. A blood sugar of 150 is perfectly okay. But another area where the nephrologists and the intensivists are at loggerheads is providing nutrition to the patient. Try to achieve total energy intake of 20 to 25 kilocalories per day to these patients. Don't be worried about the catabolic state of the patient and the protein load that you're giving to this patient, because ultimately you're going to dialyze them. So avoid protein restriction. Generally protein restriction is done in renal failure patients because it is hoped that it will prevent the initiation of dialysis. If less protein is there, creatinine will rise that much, urea would rise that much less. That is the previous ideas, but we tend to ignore that. We tend to, because we believe that our patients are in a catabolic stage and that catabolism is the reason for AKI, we tend to give them with protein supplementation. We know that we will not achieve uniform or zero nitrogen balance, but at least we can reduce the amount of negative nitrogen balance that this patient is having. And if at all you are going to feed this patient, make sure that you feed them enterally, and I will not go into details as to why enteral feeding is better. Administer protein in adequate quantities. Its patient is not on dialysis, you can give around 1 gram per kilo. If the patient is on dialysis, you can go up to 1.5, and if the patient is on continuous renal replacement therapy, you can go even as high as 1.7 grams per kilo. And again, I don't have to say over and over again, avoid the use of diuretics to prevent AKI. So AKI carries significant attributable mortality. There is research needed on biomarkers. The mainstay of prevention of AKI in the ICU is hydration, avoid nephrotoxic drugs, and maintenance of adequate perfusion pressure if necessary by noradrenaline. There is no role for dopamine or diuretics in prevention of AKI. N-acetylcysteine is potentially beneficial, but the jury is still out. We don't know really whether it makes an effect or not. And no role as of now on theophylline and phenoldiazepam. Maybe if more research is needed, we'll get more answers to that. I don't know how much time I have got. 15 minutes with me, but I'll take only 5 minutes more to talk about renal replacement therapy. And we'll talk about continuous renal replacement therapy, we'll talk about intermittent hemodialysis, and we'll kind of talk about SLED. The first thing that I need to talk about is the CRRT, the continuous renal replacement therapy, and the reason why it is not taken the fancy of quite a lot of Indian intensivists is because of the cost involved. There is the circuit itself costs around 18 to 19,000 in Delhi. I don't know how much it costs here, but the circuit is around 20,000 rupees. There is a sterile lactate or bicarbonate based solutions. Any answers to why? Generally the CRRT solutions are lactate based, but there are certain indications where we cannot use lactate solutions. Can you tell me which condition where I will not use lactate based solutions in CRRT? Conditions where lactate is already high. And what is that condition? No, sepsis is okay. Sepsis is okay, but there is another reason for that. No. The lactate is converted to bicarbonate, and that bicarbonate acts as the neutralizing agent in the replacement solution now. And the condition where the lactate cannot be converted to bicarbonate by human body is when the liver is not working. So in conditions where the patient is having liver failure, perhaps I have to go for bicarbonate based solution. The bicarbonate based solutions tend to be a bit more expensive because bicarbonate solutions are stable. Lactate solutions are far more, they have a higher, longer shelf life, and that's why they tend to be cheaper. So these are the things that are limiting factors in going for continuous renal replacement therapy in a big way. But we need to know a little bit about what are the principles behind how the solutes are removed from the body by this mechanism. And the standard thing is by process of diffusion, and there's another process of convection. We'll talk about each one of them. And this is the process of diffusion, in which the molecules move from a region of high concentration to a region of low concentration across the semi-permeable membrane, which was diffusion. This was taught to us way back in class 8 when we were studying physics and chemistry. So that is a simple thing that we talk about. But then there is another process of ultrafiltration, in which a pressure is applied over the blood part of the dialysis, in which added pressure causes more driving pressure across the semi-permeable membrane, and that tends to remove more of fluid in the patients, and that is the process of ultrafiltration. So you would notice that whenever we give a prescription of dialysis of a patient, we mention as to how much of ultrafiltration or how much of negative fluid balance we want to make, because in this situation sometimes we do not give replacement fluid. Now there are a lot of instances where in India we do not give replacement fluid even if we are doing a patient as doing CRRT in our patients, and there we need to know how much of negative balance that we are producing, and by that we need to just ask what is the UF rate. The UF rate could be as low as 50 ml per hour, or it could be a composite UF rate in case of hemodialysis, something like 2 liters, 2.5 liters, and you know that this amount of fluid has been taken off the patient. In the patients of chronic kidney disease who are getting dialyzed, there we get to know how much of fluid is getting removed from the patient by weighing the patient after the process of dialysis is over and prior to that. So the difference actually tells us that the dialysis machine is doing the job or not. This is so much about the ultrafiltration, and this is what we talk about diffusion, and you can see that the blood is flowing from one side to the other, and the dialysis solution is flowing on the opposite direction, and there is a concentration gradient. Urea, creatinine and other poisonous substances are higher in the blood, and they are almost zero in the dialysate. So obviously there is a diffusion gradient which pushes these so-called substances into the dialysis to be removed from the body. And then we have this hemofiltration, which works on the principles of convection. The principle of convection is that there is a mass movement of molecules, because there is a big amount of flow occurring, and when there is a big amount of flow occurring, it is something like a big amount of flow is occurring in this room, and there are some pores in the walls, and so obviously because of the pores in the walls, a lot of water which is there in this room will be get flushed into the another room, and when water moves into the other room, it carries with it certain particles which are dissolved in water, what is called as a solute drag, and that is the principle of convection that we follow in hemofiltration, which basically removes that when water moves in large quantities from one part of the membrane to the other part of the membrane, it carries with it certain solute particles, and which what the euphemistic term used is, it is called a solute drag, and by this hopefully in diffusion only very small molecules can actually travel across the semi-permeable membrane, but because of this solute drag, large molecules or what are called as intermediate molecules tend to be removed, and that is why in convection we claim that not only urea, creatinine and potassium small molecules are removed, probably some middle molecules in the form of endotoxins can also be removed, and that is why we say that in patients who are septic, to remove endotoxins we tend to do them hemodiafiltration. It is very attractive hypothesis which has not been proven completely, but that is the general opinion that people have, and that is the process of hemodiafiltration in which we add both diffusion and convection together and use it on the CRRT. Just a little bit about SLED. When we do hemodialysis for an extended period of time, normally dialysis is done for a period of 4 hours, but when we do it for a period of 8 hours or so, the ultrafiltrate that is removed from the patient's body gets that much reduced. That is the denominator gets reduced, so obviously the results get reduced, and since the ultrafiltration rate at which the fluid is removed from the body, that becomes less, the patients tend to tolerate it that much better. So that is the only difference between SLED and conventional hemodialysis. And I'm really thankful to you for having heard of me, because as I said, we have our ODD synthesis, we tend to give more importance to certain things which we like, and obviously tend to ignore certain things which probably is of more interest to you. And if I have left out something which you think is important from your point of view, as a trainee point of view, as an intensivist who dabbles in nephrology and wants to know more, I'm perfectly happy to answer your questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Shastri, for an enlightening presentation. But there are certain things which I wanted to highlight. As we well, the scope of critical care nephrology edges far beyond the acute kidney injury. There were certain issues which we need to share, that rapidly a whole breed of nephrologists are coming up who are the critical care nephrologists, and they have a close tie-up with the intensivist. When a patient comes in the medical ICU, normal encountered problem is an acute kidney injury. But we need to understand that there are various other nephrological issues which are present in that patient. Patient may be having an under chronic kidney disease, and the diagnostic, the management issues are a bit different from a patient with an acute kidney injury. He might be presenting as rapidly progressive renal failure or glomerulonephritis. So the issues are different. The second, again, very important issue is the assessment of the fluid status, which, I mean, is of quite important for everybody. And at the end of the day, there are other issues which are important for a critical care nephrologist. And hence, realizing the importance of that close association between a critical care nephrologist and the intensivist, the International Society of Nephrology has started a lot of postdoctoral fellowship programs all across the world. Sir, I have just one question to you, is that how do you assess a fluid status in a given patient in ICU, which is a very broad topic, but I just want to know from you that what normal parameters do you apply for assessing the fluid status of a patient in a ICU setting?
My first reaction that it's an affront to ask me this question, but anyway, it's such an important question that I'll be very glad to answer. The important thing is, whenever we talk about assessment of perfusion in our patients, we always start clinically. And when we start clinically, we go from head to toe. If the patient is conscious, responding to verbal commands, is oriented to place and time, we can rest assured that his brain is getting perfused. And if his heart rate and blood pressure is being maintained, we can hope that the heart is working well. If the patient is producing adequate amount of urine, which I mean around 30 to 40 ml per hour, I would expect that the kidneys are getting perfused. And if I'm feeding this patient and his feet is provided he is not having aspirates, then I would expect
the GI system is getting adequate perfusion. And finally, I touch the hands and feet of the patient.
if the hands and feet, which are the skin, which is the stepson of the heart, if they are warm and well perfused, they are warm, then obviously I would feel that even if the skin is getting perfused, then obviously the patient is getting perfused. So these are the parameters, and the rest of it, the CVP and the mean arterial pressure and the blood gases by way of base excess, lactate levels, these are all corroborative findings. For me, a CVP is just a number for me. That CVP which allows me to fulfill these criteria of perfusion, my clinical parameters of perfusion, is the right CVP. And the next time maybe I may not touch the patient, but I will target that CVP. So the assessment of perfusion again is a very, as he has already mentioned, is such an important thing which he thinks that intensivists are not capable of and only the nephrologists are capable of. Well, it is every doctor should be knowing it, and as I have myself accepted in my lecture, that is one area that we are not very good at, just because we don't clinically examine our patients, we don't touch our patients, and we don't take into the parameters holistically. We tend to see them as piecemeal. Would that answer?
Thank you, sir, for the excellent speech. Now, the floor is open for questions. Any questions from audience?
What is the status of the NGAL? Whether you are saying that you should not use NGAL till many of the people will force you to use NGAL, or you are using NGAL in selective session?
I have not started using NGAL. I've got academic interest in it because I hope, as I said, in 2001 and 2002, when I was doing a study on renal failure, in post-operative renal failure, the marker that I used to predict renal failure in those patients who did not have pre-existing renal failure at all, but because of the insult of the operation, massive fluid shift during the operation, they were likely candidates to develop renal failure. So one of the markers to show that these patients are having renal failure that I used at that time was cystatin. But cystatin, again, there was problem with the labs and other, they would not give it to me properly. I got this interest because NGAL came into the market. It became a commercially available kit. So especially in those cases where I'm doing some research work, I would probably go for NGAL. But on a clinical basis, it is such an expensive thing, and again, it has got its own limitations. A lot of patients who are having sepsis, creatinine levels, the levels of creatinine tend to interfere with it. High creatinine tends to interfere with NGAL estimation. So it has got a lot of confounding features. It hasn't become such a popular thing. It has got its, and that is why NGAL will take some time to take over until we probably get a better biomarkers. And to really get a biomarker, something like a procalcitonin to diagnose sepsis is still some way off, and we have not achieved that level as yet. So we'll have to just wait and watch. NGAL is the only thing which is shown promise, had come into commercial practice also, but the very fact that all of you are not using it would mean that it has got its own limitation. Across the world also, NGAL is not used routinely, except for some research work where we tend to have some objective evidence to say that there is so. So just because it is there, that's why we do it, but still it is not foolproof. Yes.
So I think I would like to add on NGAL, why the KDIGO has not suggested in favor of NGAL. Perhaps they have not given the reasons, but I believe that NGAL would not change the fluid therapy, NGAL would not change the norepinephrine, NGAL would not change the dialysis. So therapeutic aspects are not going to change.
That is why I said, of course, KDIGO guidelines.
Predict the
Yeah.
also. I only think that urinary NGAL can differentiate between pre-renal and renal because tubules are not damaged. So in renal, ATN, acute tubular necrosis, urinary NGAL can increase, which can differentiate that it is not pre-renal and it is renal. So future chances of developing AKI, ATN is
Yeah, that's an attractive proposition, but unfortunately, even urinary NGAL has not been validated in a clinical setup. It has not been validated in a clinical setup. That is the limitation.
This is the only reason that renal biomarkers have not really picked up.
Picked up, yes.
Even if we know that the kidneys are injuring, we can't do anything.
In the subset of patients, it's early patients, where the creatinine is not a good marker, so
Creatinine was never a good marker, but we are still using it.